Let it do its thing. All right, come on, YouTube. You can do it. I know you can. There we are. And we will hit record to. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute. And over there is William Bell in Memphis, Tennessee. He is the president of All Things Fulfilled. William, it's great to be back. And I want to thank you and Larry for filling in for me last week. Like I mentioned to you, my pickup that has 47,000 actual miles on it, the transmission decided to go bye-bye.
Wow. That's not good.
That is not good at all. I had been hearing that Ford was having trouble with their 10-speed transmissions. And as a matter of fact, right after I got the truck, I probably had, I don't know, 10 or 12,000 miles on it. And I was talking to a Ford certified mechanic. And he asked me how I liked it. And I said, I absolutely love the truck. I love the way it rides. I love its power. I love its economy. And he said, well, guess what? Is that a 10-speed? And I said, yeah. He said, well, guess what? You're going to have trouble with that. And I go, oh, wait a minute. What are we talking about here? He said, well, look, Ford is having all sorts of trouble with that 10-speed transmission. There's a machining issue inside in what they call the main hub. And he said, when it starts going bad with just very, very little wear, it destroys the clutches and your transmission is gone. Oh, no. And it's not something you can fix with different lubricants. It's just machining. Well, I've had it in the shop 3 different times because it would start hard downshifting, hard upshifting. Well, they were able to recalibrate the computer and it would be okay for several months. Well, it started it again, only this time it's really weird. It was worse. I go, yeah. And then, of course, by this time, I'm reading all of these stories on the internet about Ford truck and transmissions going out. And I go, yeah, here comes that train. Well, a week and a half ago, I put one of my vehicles on a trailer to take it to a machinist or mechanic to work on it. And I've got it in tow mode. And when it upshifted from first to second, I literally thought the transmission was going to fall out of the truck. It sounded so bad.
Wow.
I go, uh-oh, here we come. So when I got going, okay, go up speed, come to downshift, and when it downshifted from third to second, same sound. Clank. Yeah, uh-oh. So when it did that on the downshift, I immediately got on the phone and called the dealership and I said, okay, here's what it's doing. And the service manager said, well, Mr. Preston, get it in as soon as you can. We set an appointment. And she goes, yeah, we're having tons of problems with that problem. She said, we're changing out transmissions, rebuilding transmissions like you would not believe. So here we are.
So are they going to rebuild it, or
they have
get a new one?
They have rebuilt it. I told them I did not like the idea. I wanted a new one. They talked to Ford, and Ford has come out with a remanufactured, remachined hub that corrects the problem of the originals. And at least that's the story she told me. And what they have done, they've given me an extended warranty from 50,000 miles all the way to 75,000 miles. So that's at least something. And we'll see. But she swears up and down that the rebuilt kit has the corrected hub in it and that it will be basically a brand new transmission.
Well, let's hope so. I definitely hope that you get it up and running, that it's no problem, and that they take care of all the expenses to do it.
I'm going to drive the fool out of it.
You're going to run
I
your warranty out quick too.
well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to work that thing really, really hard. I'm going to put
Mhm.
it to the test before that extended warranty ever runs out, and we'll see if it's going to stand up to what I'm going to put it through.
Okay.
So anyway, let me say again how much I appreciate you and Larry filling in for me last week. I had to take that truck to the dealership. It's out of state. It's all the way down in Texas. It's a good ways from me.
Hold on. I just pulled my headset cord out of my,
Ah,
of my speaker.
okay. So anyway, folks, I know, and Larry had informed me what he and William talked about. It sounded like a really good subject, really good program. And so, it's absolutely great to have people, good people, reliable people, sound people uh, that are capable and willing to fill in when I'm not able to be here. Of course, William and I have been working together for how long, William?
It's been a long time. It's been a long time. I don't know if I can even remember. Um,
Yeah, many years ago, many
Many
years ago.
years, many moons, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, but
So
Larry and I had fun.
oh yeah, I'm sure you did. Yeah. So do you want to share with us again, refresher what you guys talked, or you want to get right back to the issue of the Messianic temple?
Well, we can do a little bit of both. I'll just briefly talk about. We discussed somewhat on First Corinthians chapter 15 and talked about the um, verbs in that chapter and how they expressed the fact that this was something that was present and ongoing at the time that Paul wrote, that he wasn't dealing with physical bodies, etc. We also revisited 1 Corinthians 15:49, talked
Mm,
about that verse a little bit, and the impact that that has on the subject, and how several people either avoid it or are just unaware of what that verse does and the impact it has on the study of 1 Corinthians 15. So that was kind of the gist of what we discussed on last week. But like I said, it was a very enjoyable conversation. It was enlightening. Larry brought a lot of good points to the table, and so we just kind of tossed it back. Uh, we talked a little bit about how we met as well. Larry was still attending the School of Preaching
yeah.
when we did, and so we kind of shared that. And there are some people who like to hear those war stories, and so I
Yeah.
got some feedback from some people saying, "Hey, I really enjoyed hearing how that all happened," and it was just kind of funny, that Larry and them came to the house. And the one thing I remembered when they left was Larry said they told me after they got they got back to school, and when we talked again, he said we were in the car on the way back saying, "Tell me this is not true. Tell me this is not true."
Yeah, I can
uh,
understand that.
yeah, and but yeah, that's pretty much the gist of what we covered.
It's interesting, and Larry had given me an idea that maybe that's what you wanted to do when I contacted him. But it's interesting that you went into the verb tenses there in 1 Corinthians 15,
Mhm.
because just this last week, I was in this engagement on Facebook with a guy who's been stalking me now for a good little while. Um, and what have you, talking about the ontological reality of, all of this kind of stuff. Like, you've got to be able to see. I know that Jesus said the kingdom does not come with observation, but that's not really true, because you can see things. I mean, he calls Jesus a liar, is
Mhm.
basically what he does.
Yeah.
But in one of my responses to him, I drew attention to the fact that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 uses the present passive indicatives and the present active indicatives
Mhm.
no less than 10 times. And I said, from your perspective, resurrection has to be the raising of biological bodies out of the ground. Paul said it was already taking place. So you explain to me, where were those bodies coming out of the grave? And he wrote a response that long with
Mhm.
not one word said about the present passive indicatives.
Yeah, well, that's been typical of the responses that I've read from him, it doesn't matter whether it's you, Roy, or whatever. And I did read your article on that post. It was excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
And I haven't gone back to see what he wrote about it. It'd be interesting to see what he said about
you
it.
really have to do that because it's really interesting. Yeah.
I'm going to do it, but he did the same thing to me. I asked him, I said, well, is it really necessary that a person knows that to determine whether prophecy has been fulfilled or not fulfilled? And that was one of the follow-up questions I asked him. And then he went into another diversion, so to speak, and a bunch of accusations from that response, but he never did answer that question. So I just repeated it back to him. But I've got some information I'm going to share with you. I submitted some questions, and I want to share these with you. I had intended to do it before now, but what I had also intended to do was ask a few more questions to try to get a little bit more information. But I thought what I got was very good, and I'll let you know what the source, who the source is, and what the responses are, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay. By the way, I wanted to share another little anecdote. Another person chimed in and said, surely you understand that all of the present passives, et cetera, in 1 Corinthians 15, they're nothing but nomics. And so I responded to that. I don't remember if I tagged you in that particular chain or not, but nonetheless, he said they're nothing but nomics. Now, for those who do not know, nomics is a present passive or a present active indicative that is expressed in present passive or present indicative, but it's timeless. It doesn't actually indicate that the subject that is being discussed is actually taking place at that time. It's just something that happens and can be expressed as a present. In other words, there's no time element in it. And so I responded with this individual. I said, well, what I want you to explain is, why is it that the only present passive and present active indicatives that you are saying are nomics are the ones that speak of the then ongoing resurrection? Why don't you say that about all of the other present passives and all of the other present indicatives in the chapter? And furthermore, why are you appealing to the rarest form of the present tense verbs in order to avoid the implications of those verb tenses?
Yeah, that's the evidence. Yeah, that's the evidence that they see the impact of those verb tenses, and they're looking for a way to try to, explain them away. Yeah, and it's just impossible to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying, and Zach Davis and I had a program on this last week, and I brought up those verb tenses. It's kind of interesting how this subject is coming up in different blog discussions and what have you. But I said it's really fascinating to me the lengths to which people will go to try to avoid it, the reality of those verb tenses. And I said, I remember when Jim Gunter, and I'm real sure it was Jim Gunter who introduced those present passives to me years and years and years ago. I mean, my goodness, it's been a long time. And I mean, it just blew my mind. I had never noticed that. And so it led me to really dig into the text of 1 Corinthians 15 and to confirm for myself the use of these present passives. And it's so fascinating to me, and I know you know this very well, but here is Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 to 4. He uses both the present active and the present passive indicatives in those first 4 verses, okay, which basically is setting the tone for the rest of the chapter. Nobody argues, oh, well, the present passives and the present indicatives in those verses, those are just nomics. They don't really carry any temporal significance to them. It's like I said, only in the verses that speak of the then, or that would be speaking if you grant the verb tenses, only in those verses that speak of the then ongoing resurrection do they all of a sudden go, oh, the verb tenses here don't mean anything. But make no mistake, folks, I'm sitting here looking at my New International Greek Testament commentaries and other works on the Greek, just right here at hand's breadth or arm's length. The present passives and the present indicatives in 1 Corinthians 15 have given world-class Greek scholars trouble. They see the problem and they go to lots and lots of around the mountain, attempts to avoid the problem, but they see the problem. So anyway, you want to share with us what you were going to, or do you want to get into something else and then lead into it? What do you want to do?
Well, I think that was, pretty much it. You talked about when you learned about those present active and present passive. I shared last week that the first time I learned about them, it was years ago. I actually translated the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians 15, particularly focusing on the verb tenses, and that's where I discovered them. And it was sometime later that I looked at 1 Corinthians 15:49.
Yeah.
But when I saw that, it was like, boom. And then Larry and I shared when we went to Minnesota, I think it was, or was it Wisconsin? When we went to that event, I think it was 2014 or something like that. Because you didn't go for some reason that year, but I can't remember I don't know, Don. I think the older I get, the less I remember. But anyway, I don't want to say too much about age because
I sympathize entirely.
But anyway, when we went there, and I want to say it was Wisconsin, but nevertheless, I think I shared with you when we went there, I had been reading Ed Stevens's paper on I think it was the death of Adam or something. I shared, some of my research and work on that, and mentioned it to Ed, and we got into a discussion about that verse. And that was following our 2011 conference, right? When we all spoke on that, I think you had a debate that same year. But anyway, when we spoke about it, Ed came up with some interpretation. I can't remember what it was, but he was trying to argue for something different than what the actual text was saying and what it meant. And so he said, okay, we had all the Greek scholars there, right? I mean, they were everywhere. And so we had a booth, and so we just pulled a few of them together and we asked the question, can this verse be interpreted in the way that he was suggesting? And they said, I mean, an absolute, emphatic, no, it could not. And so that left the door open. And ironically, it was Ed who came back in some of the research and expanded on one of the studies that he did. He brought in a lot more sources that dealt with that verse and admitted that if this verse is to be understood as the aorist subjunctive, then it means that this is already taken place or was already in progress at the time.
Exactly.
And if that is the case, that means that resurrection was happening in real time.
Yep.
While they were living, and not a situation where they were waiting until they die. And that's, you mentioned the New International Commentary. I think that's Gordon Fee.
Yes.
Yeah. When you talked about the scholars, that was another point that we mentioned, and he definitely admits
that's Thistleton.
Okay,
Thistleton.
Well,
Gordon Fee has one. That's right.
Yeah,
but I was looking at New International Greek Testament Commentary. Yeah.
This is what I'm talking about. Well, it's somewhere in the around page 700 or so, but he gets into a discussion on it and says, "Look, you can't ignore this." And he's forced to come up with an interpretation that aligns with the verses, that makes the Greek makes his interpretation consistent with the Greek. The only difference is he changes from resurrection and says, well, it has to be some kind of biological modifications, some kind of practical modifications. But I thought it was very interesting. But you cannot read him and see that, and not see that he's looking at this thing and he sees what the problem is, and even attempts to offer a solution for it. And so I think that anybody who's looking into that should go and read that. And of course, you've submitted some great sources on it as well in the past that supported that as well, because you pulled a few scholars that address the same thing. So it's just a powerful text. and anyone who wants to get into it. And the one thing I like about what he said the majority of the manuscripts contain the aorist subjunctive. Correct. And only just a few, which are faulty manuscripts, contain the futurist, the future tense. And he said that's proof positive that the majority of the manuscripts are correct. Correct. And the few that do not are the ones that are incorrect. So people should look at that evidence, because it's just devastating to a future physical body resurrection. It destroys it.
Yeah. And folks, if you're not following exactly what we're talking about here, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15:49, many translations, many English translations of the Greek render that, as we have borne the image of the earthly, we shall bear the image of the heavenly. Well, okay, that's granted. That is a common translation. However, the original Greek in the majority of the Greek manuscripts, and William mentioned that I've got a source. I've got a very good friend named Paul Anderson. He works with the ancient manuscripts every single day. He is part of an organization that deals with the ancient texts. He is absolutely brilliant. If I ever have a question about any variants, if I ever have a question about what is the best attested Greek text, send him an email. Boy, he sends me back, stuff. And it's just a great resource to be able to have. And he's preterist, by the way, through and through. So that's a fascinating thing. We have people sometimes who scoff at those of us who are preterists, say, oh, there are no scholars among you. Well, this dude's a scholar, let me tell you. So anyway, I contacted him when the question of 1 Corinthians 15:49 came up. The question is, should it be, as we have borne, we shall bear? Or is it, according to the majority of the Greek text, as we have borne, let us bear? And it's really interesting, folks, when you read the commentaries, and William was sharing with us Gordon Fee. Well, Gordon Fee struggles, but Gordon Fee knows that the preponderant evidence, the preponderant weight of evidence, is for what is known as the aorist subjunctive, which would be translated, let us bear. Okay, so it's not a declaration, as so many Greek English translations say. It's not a declaration of a simple future, oh, we will bear. No. That is not the correct translation according to these Greek scholars. Not according to Don Preston, not according to William Bell. We're relying on real Greek scholars, world-class Greek scholars who are absolutely recognized for their Greek scholarship. So here is Paul saying, as we have borne the image of the earthly, let us bear the image of the heavenly. Now, first of all, folks, and I hope you'll catch the power of this, notice that Paul uses an aorist tense to say, as we have borne the image of the earthly. Well, wait a minute. If we're talking about biological bodies here, how could Paul say, yeah, we once bore that body, but we don't have that body anymore? The image of that body. So that just rules it out from a physical perspective, and which brings up that question, what is the ontological reality here? That aorist tense deals a death blow to this ontological argument having to deal with physical realities. Mm-hmm. It just blows it absolutely out of the water. So what did Paul mean? Let us bear the image of the heavenly. Well, we can take up a lot of programs talking about the image of God in Genesis 1. Let us make man in our image, and how through sin man lost the image of God. But through Christ, that image is being recreated. And you find that in Ephesians 4, putting off the old man, which is corrupt according to deceitful lust, put on the new man. Colossians chapter 1, you have put off the old man. Therefore, put on the new man, which is created in the image of the one who created him. Colossians chapter 2, you have put off the body of flesh. You've died. Now you're being raised in Christ. You were once dead. Now you're alive. That's putting off the old man of death, the body of death, Romans 6:5 and following, and on and on and on. And so, you know, this whole concept of image, and I find it really, really fascinating, William. R.C.H. Linsky, in his commentary, says, well, the better attested Greek is the aorist subjunctive, but we can't allow that because that would mean that man has a role in determining his resurrection.
Yes.
Well, yeah, he's exactly right.
Yeah, and that's the power of it. It means that the individuals, the subjects in the text, are actually participating in the process, but because of the aorist, that indicates that they had already begun that process in the past, but the subjunctive indicates that there was a future to its consummation. And so as much as people want to talk about, oh, these guys have a process resurrection and, it takes place over a period of 40 years and, it's present and ongoing, rather than some instantaneous, in a moment, twinkling of an eye, snap your fingers and you've gone from, one physical body to a non-corporeal body. That's not the idea that's expressed in the text. Whatever it is, it's already underway. They're already participating. Right. And by the way, as you've already mentioned, Romans chapter 6 has that same aorist subjunctive in there. We shall be in the likeness of Christ, etc. And we should walk in newness of life. And then you have the same thing in Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. So if you look at those passages, you'll see the same construction in the Greek. And who would deny that they had already begun the putting on of Christ in Romans chapter 6 by reading Romans 13 and trying to put that wholly in the future by ignoring what had already occurred in the past. So it just doesn't work in any of those texts. And then Paul lives it out in Philippians chapter 3, 11 and 12 anyway.
Through 16, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, not that I've already attained, but to the degree I already have attained. Yeah, exactly. And so all of this, folks, guess what? This is related to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and the Messianic temple that we have discussed before. Because Paul says, if this earthly tabernacle, house of this tabernacle be dissolved, we have a building of God, house not made with hands. And then he talks about how we are groaning, not that we would be unclothed, but clothed. And Paul just goes through the whole discussion. And boy, I had a guy castigate me today. You are just absolutely, completely a false teacher because 2 Corinthians chapter 5 is all about physical body. Mm-hmm. I haven't answered him.
Speaking about that, going back to your person who's trolling you, I noticed in one of his responses, he talked about the inner man in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 16. And people want to use that in sort of a Greek Platonic type situation where you are pitting the physical body over against, the spirit or the soul or something. That's not what Paul is dealing with at all in that text. The inner man is the new covenant man. Yep. And the outer man is the old covenant man. That's where he starts, as you were suggesting, in 2 Corinthians 3, and he carries that all the way through into chapter 6. So it's very important that people recognize that and see, so that you have that consistency running through the text as opposed to trying to jump into something physical. And that's why they are using that text in 2 Corinthians 5 to talk about, the earthly body being a physical body and the heavenly body being a non-physical body. That's not the case. And the fact that Paul says that they did not want to be unclothed, which is what you have in most of your physical paradigms, because you got a situation where they shed the body and they are waiting at some time in the future to take on another body. Paul says, no, that's what we don't want. That's what the Spirit has been given to prevent. And so the transformation was already underway. They were being clothed with the new body, just like in 1 Corinthians 15, 49. They're parallel. The two
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
chapters are parallel in their tenses as well. And even in the article that you wrote, you called attention to 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18, that they were being transformed from, one body, or from the image of the earthly to the image of the heavenly. The same concepts found in chapter 15 are in 2 Corinthians 3 through 5, all the way through chapter 6. 7:1 actually.
But William, 2 Corinthians 5 is such a good funeral passage. I've got to tell this quick anecdote here, and then we'll move on. Some years ago, you remember Bobby Stash?
Yes.
Okay, great guy, wonderful friend. His mother passed away. She was just a marvelous Christian lady. I mean, just such a gracious, wonderful, humble woman, full of good works. I mean, just, truly a jewel of a lady.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I attended the funeral, and they had a guy preaching who happened to know me. And I sort of kind of expected, knowing him, that a shot or two would be thrown my way. Okay. Well, guess what his text was? 2 Corinthians chapter 5.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, he just starts lathering up on it, and he just kept going on and on. Our sister is not with us today. She is with the Lord in heaven. And he caught himself. And he said, now, not really with the Lord in heaven. We know that she's in Abraham's bosom. Well, look, Bobby just about came up out of his chair. Bobby was not one to hold back. And I looked over at him, and he kind of glanced over at me, and he just kind of shook his head. It's like, okay, I'm going to keep quiet. I'm not going to be disruptive at his mother's funeral and what have you. Mm-hmm. Well, about that time, the preacher caught himself, and he started trying to extricate himself from the mess that he had made. He had just said she was with the Lord. Now she's not with the Lord. So how does he bring comfort by saying she's not with the Lord? Well, Hades is not really a bad place after all. Just on and on he went. And I'm just sitting there. I tried really, really hard not to make any facial expressions. But this is a really classic example, William, as you so well know, of how traditional eschatologies come face to face with problems. Because everyone, when they're preaching the funeral of a faithful Christian, they want to say they're with the Lord. As I've always said, we have a funeral eschatology and we have a sermon eschatology, a Sunday morning eschatology. The funeral eschatology says when a faithful Christian dies, they go to be with the Lord. They are in the bosom of Jesus Christ, blessed eternally. But on Sunday morning, well, now when the faithful child of God dies, they're not with Christ because Christ is not in Hades. And they're in Abraham's bosom. And Abraham's bosom is a place of rest, but it's not the place of final salvation, because after all, we got to have our physical bodies to be with Christ in heaven, where Christ doesn't have a physical body. Well, maybe he does. Maybe he does. I don't know. Who knows? And so around and around and around it goes with these two different eschatologies, one for funerals, one for Sunday morning.
Yeah. And, on 2 Corinthians 5, that text was used by Gus Nichols to teach that very thing. And of course, he debated Max King. I can't remember if that particular text came up, but it was well known that he used that text to talk about, presently being in heaven, which contradicted their whole futurist paradigm.
Yeah, exactly right. And you and I have both, I'm assuming you did, I've been to lectureships in which the questions were raised. Well, where does the faithful child of God go today? Mm-hmm. And you have these eminent ministers, Guy and Woods took one position, Gus Nichols took a different position. Mm-hmm. Okay. And everybody got along. Nobody condemned each other for the other. But I well remember reading different ministers in the churches of Christ who said, well, if you say that when the faithful child of God dies, they go directly to heaven, then you're saying that Christ has already come, because you can't go to heaven unless Christ has come and salvation is ours, salvation is completed, et cetera, et cetera. And the other side arguing, no, 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 you can't say we go to heaven at all. You got to go to Abraham's bosom. And so the conflict, here they go side to side, or head to head rather, and yet we're supposed to be the heretics, even though we agree with one side, at least to a great extent.
Yeah.
And to bring this back to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, it's interesting to me. Once again, here's Paul talking about Messianic temple. And it all goes back to Ezekiel chapter 37 and the prophecy there of Israel being raised from the dead through the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, God establishing his tabernacle in Israel so that all nations would serve Israel, or serve God through Israel, I should say. And so that's the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And in spite of what Richard Carrier said in my debate with him, in claiming, well, the New Testament writers are giving their pesher, i.e. their commentary on the Old Testament, and radically changing the interpretation. Well, I agree 100%, and I've said it on many, many occasions. Paul is in fact giving his pesher, his commentary on Ezekiel 37, but he's not radically changing. He was showing the true meaning of it and not violating Ezekiel 37. And the tabernacle that Ezekiel 37 was actually predicting was not a literal physical tabernacle. It was the spiritual body of Christ. That's Paul's pesher. And so Richard Carrier just completely, totally missed the force and the power, but that was his escape hatch when he couldn't answer the argument. The kingdom does not come without observation. Well, this is Jesus giving his pesher. Well, what does that mean? You're just trying to deny what the Lord said. That's all the world he was trying to do. And you're trying to say that Paul, okay, Jesus talked spiritually, but Paul's talking literally because he's giving the pesher. That doesn't work at all.
Right.
Does not work at all. So, as William was saying, and as I am saying here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, this is all Messianic temple. This is Paul talking about the old covenant temple, the outward man perishing, the inner man, that spiritual temple of Christ being renewed. It was under construction. Paul makes it abundantly clear in Ephesians 2:19 and following. You therefore, speaking to Gentiles, are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. You're being built up a habitation of God through the Spirit. There's that present active construction of the Messianic temple. And so many people miss this. And by the way, I want to inject this that you were talking about. You referred to it a few moments ago about that ongoing process. It's really, really fascinating to me, William, of how scholars so often recognize how all of this relates to the second Exodus. The construction of the tabernacle took place when? During the Exodus. So when Paul, in Ephesians and Colossians, when Paul uses second Exodus language and throws in the discussion of the tabernacle, or the temple, if you please, this all goes together. And I've been reading this book. This is one of those books I read a snatch here and a snatch there, But I've been rereading this book, Jesus and Israel's Traditions of Judgment and Restoration. And this is by Stephen Bryant. Excellent little book. Excellent little book. I think I recommended this to you some years ago, actually. I've had it for several years. And like I said, I'll pick it up and I will read 5 or 6 pages. And then I'll pick up 4 other books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know. You do exactly like I do. But I want to read for you and for our audience this concept of how scholarship recognizes this concept, messianic temple, kingdom, second Exodus. And it's related to the millennium. Because when does the kingdom come? Or to rephrase it, when does the new creation come? Oh, at the end of the millennium. Okay. So on page 28, Brian says, speaking of the Qumran community and Josephus, I'm not going to read all of Josephus and what he said, but commenting on the Qumran community, he says, as in Scripture itself, a typological pattern of expectation based on the Exodus served as a primary, catch that, folks, as a primary ideological motivation for the Qumran community. In other words, he's saying, guess what? The Qumran community understood that the first Exodus was typological, not only in its event, but its duration. Okay? Consciously, to continue the quote, consciously drawing on Isaiah 40, they perceived their flight into the wilderness as preparing the way for eschatological deliverance. And he gives the Dead Sea Scroll reference. The proximate causes for withdrawal into the desert are obscure, but the hope of the sectarians for a reenactment of divine deliverance in the wilderness is clear. But if the withdrawal into the wilderness, that is by the Qumran community, is a self-conscious reenactment of a new Exodus, then a new conquest lies on the horizon of their immediate future. Their present experience in the wilderness is thus conceived of as a time of affliction prior to their inheritance of the land and their possession of it by means of the final eschatological war. This sounds like Revelation. I mean, at the end of the millennium, you have Satan being loose, going out to call the nations of the earth to the war. Destruction comes from the Almighty by fire coming down from heaven. And what's the result of it? Judgment, kingdom, resurrection, new creation.
New temple.
New temple. New temple. Folks, and of course, I'm writing a book right now on the millennium, have been writing a book for a good while on it. What we see in Jesus and the New Testament writers is an awareness of, of the eschatological narrative of the Jews around them. And I've pointed this out many, many times. Jesus agreed with the chronological narrative of the Jews. That is, Elijah would come, tribulation would come, judgment would come, resurrection would come, Messiah would come, kingdom, new creation would come. Jesus disagreed with them as to the nature of those things. They expected a literal physical reincarnation of Elijah. That's not what Jesus taught. They expected that literal physical kingdom, literal physical resurrection, on and on. Mm-hmm. And Jesus categorically rejected their physical nationalistic aspirations, agreeing with the chronological narrative and timeline, agreeing with the, how should I express this? Agreeing with the terminology, disagreeing with the nature. Your comments, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's exactly and precisely it. You've done in the past, excellent work on John 6, that when they offered Jesus the physical kingdom, as a result of his performing the miracles, etc., that's when he withdrew from them. So he rejected them, or they rejected him after he had rejected them in the nature of the kingdom. And so all through, even John 18, when he's before Pilate, are you a king? And he says, yes, I am, but my kingdom is not of this world, etc. If it were, then my servants would fight, etc. So from that perspective, you just don't have any support for the physical nature of the coming of the kingdom, the physical nature of the tabernacle, and really of the coming period. It just isn't there because, as I always say, the kingdom does not come with observation. Christ comes in his kingdom. Therefore, Christ does not come with observation from the standpoint of, physically and visibly seeing it. So, that's just a very powerful concept and point, yet it's one that is rejected by so many because, we're still dealing with these physical concepts.
Yeah, and I brought this up at least 3 times in my debate with Richard Carrier about the coming of the kingdom without observation. The parousia and the kingdom are synchronous events, therefore the parousia would not be physical. I brought it up over and over again, in which Jesus rejected their physical offer of the nationalistic kingdom, thus rejecting their concept of the kingdom. I brought up at least a couple of different times, my kingdom is not of this world, as you quoted from John chapter 18:36, or else my servants would fight. Richard Carey had no answer for any of that except simply to say, go to 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, 2 Corinthians 5. Well, Paul's very definitely anticipating physical realities. Well, then Paul was expecting something different from Jesus. And when I would bring up Colossians chapter 1, I brought it up at least twice that I remember. Paul said that the Colossians had been translated out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of God's dear Son. If we are talking about ontological, biological, physical realities, that passage does not work. And this guy on Facebook that's been stalking me says you're completely misunderstanding it. Well, no, I'm not. You're the one imposing a physical, nationalistic, ontological reality on the nature of the kingdom, the nature of the resurrection. And nobody understands, not even he would understand, that the darkness out of which they had been translated was literal, physical, observable, ontological darkness. It was spiritual darkness.
Right. The text like Colossians 1, he's translated us out of the power of darkness into the kingdom of his dear Son, or the Son of his love. So there is coming out of darkness right there in broad daylight, if you please, from that perspective. And it has nothing to do with physical darkness, nor physical light from that perspective. And so these are the concepts that people are struggling with. And those are the concepts that these arguments are based on, where, these questions are coming up. What did they feel? What did they think? What did they see, et cetera? And what happened inside their heads? All based on arguing that all of this is of a physical nature. And so it's really an attempt to deny the fulfillment of these things. And if you can deny the fulfillment, then you got an argument for, oh, well, then God doesn't exist because he lied. That's the end result of that.
Or conversely, for the futurist, if it didn't happen physically in Jesus's day as he predicted, then it must still be future.
Yes.
I was reading today, I got on the internet and did a search on the second Exodus. And I read this one article and it was entitled, Why the Second Exodus is Still Future to Us. And I was like, oh, okay, I got to read this. I mean, and this is a professor in a seminary teaching MDiv students about the second Exodus and why it's still future to us. And I just sat there shaking my head, literally in amazement. Now, what was interesting is he gave several points from the New Testament, from Jesus and Paul both, that are second Exodus motifs. He ignores the fact that they were taking place in the first century and is putting them in our future. This is this is gross anachronism. I mean, that's really all in the world that you can call it. How can you argue that here is Jesus, Luke chapter 9, I believe it's verse 54, when Jesus began to speak to his own apostles about his, some translations simply render it as his departure, but the Greek is Exodus.
Verse 31.
Oh, okay, verse 31. Okay. But the point of it is, here's Jesus teaching his apostles, he's the second Moses. That's what he's telling them about. And that the second Exodus is taking place. I mean, after all, I am the bread of life that has come down from the Father. I am the water of life. As Moses gave you manna, as Moses gave you water. All of those are drawn
in the wilderness. All of those.
All of those. In fact, there's a book out written by a minister from Oklahoma City. It is Moses in Christ, I believe is the name of it, in the book of John. One of those really, really, really excellent books that when you read it, as you're reading it, you're going, this dude has to be a preterist. He cannot be a futurist. And he does this fantastic job of drawing out the second Exodus imagery all throughout the Gospel of John. And then every once in a while, literally out of the clear blue sky, he'll interject, well, when the Lord comes and takes us to heaven, and you're going, my goodness gracious, where did you get that from the discussion that you're offering us?
Right.
And it literally is amazing. Now, we could go on and on about that. All of this is related to the Messianic temple and the nature of that temple. But I want to shift gears a little bit in the very few minutes that we've got remaining here, William. And I want to go to Hebrews chapter 7. And I want to focus in, and we'll just really, we'll just introduce this tonight, I'm sure. Maybe we'll cover more territory than I envision. But in Hebrews chapter 7, I'm going to begin reading with verse 20. Inasmuch as he was not made priest without an oath, for they had become priest without an oath, but he with an oath. But him who said to him, the Lord has sworn, will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, here's what I want to get at, William, and I want your comments on it. You and I have discussed this in time past. By so much more, that is, by so much more power of the oath to make Christ the high priest, as I understand it, by so much more, Jesus has become a surety of a better covenant. William, you and I were raised hearing, it's still taught, it's what most people say. Well, the new covenant was confirmed by the death of Jesus, Galatians chapter 3:15 and 16. It was complete and total. We're not, they were not waiting for the new covenant. It was already there. It was already signed, sealed, and delivered. Yet here is the writer of Hebrews saying that Christ has become the surety. Now, the Greek word is egus. We would spell it eggous, egus, which means guarantee. Well, if you've got something already, what do you need a guarantee for? Your thoughts on this? What does this say about the new covenant and whether or not it was completed already?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you read Hebrews chapter 7 particularly, and pay attention to the verbs in the text as well, you will see that he's not saying that this has been completed. And when he uses the term here and saying that Christ became the surety of a better covenant, then as you say, that indicates that he's a guarantee of something that is going to be delivered at some time in the future. I remember a lesson Jack Scott did some years ago when we were doing the Max King lectures, and he taught on this subject, and he says that he was a Bell's bondsman. That's the idea of the use of this term. And so it's not saying that the new covenant is already there. And of course, all you have to do is keep going and get down to verse 13 of chapter 8.
Yeah.
A new covenant, he's made the first old or obsolete. Now that which is becoming, again, paying attention to the verbs, is becoming obsolete, is now ready or at hand to vanish away. So that means that it has not already, and the new covenant is not yet completed, but it's in the process of being completed. And for that reason, Christ became the surety that it would happen. So he was that guarantee that God would deliver that new covenant. And the essence of that new covenant would be to remember their sins no more. And, that takes you back to that covenantal statement in Romans 11. This is my covenant with them when I will take away their sins. So that is how I would understand that in terms of this guarantee of something that would take place in the future.
I see a direct correlation here between the agus, the guarantee of the coming and being presently being delivered, new covenant, and the arabon.
Yes.
Ephesians chapter 1. You were sealed with that Holy Spirit of promise, which is the earnest, the arabon of the redemption of the purchased possession. I asked someone just recently because they were just insisting that the salvation was already completed. It was a consummated reality. Forgiveness was a consummated reality, et cetera, et cetera. And it's false teaching to say that salvation wouldn't come until the parousia, in spite of Hebrews 9:28. I sometimes you just got to shake your head. And somebody say, well, no, salvation was already complete. And then you bring up Hebrews 9:28. Well, that's a different kind of salvation. Okay, whatever. But the point being, I asked this individual, and this was on YouTube, if they already had forgiveness, if they already had salvation, if they already had redemption, in other words, then what did they need the arabon for? Because the arabon was the guarantee of the redemption of the purchased possession. And to me, in Ephesians, you have the following outline of redemption. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, speaking of Christ, in whom we have, present active, redemption, even the forgiveness of our sin. Now that sounds like a done deal. Yeah, I agree. It sounds like a done deal. But then he turns right around in verse 12 and 13 and says, you have received the earnest, the guarantee of the Holy Spirit, which was the charismatic gifts of the coming redemption of the purchased possession. Well, if they've already been redeemed, what do they need the Spirit for? The Spirit is guaranteeing that redemption. And then in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 30, he says, you have the Spirit as the earnest of the coming redemption at the day of the Lord. So here we have a present reality, a guarantee of reality, and a promise of the completion of the reality. Have I outlined that?
Oh, yeah,
correct?
yeah. As a matter of fact, as I was speaking about the surety, that's exactly what I was thinking in the back of my mind, and that was the correlation with Ephesians and the arabon. So that's very, very powerful. And that what that does is kind of ties in what we were saying before on resurrection, because the time of redemption is the time of resurrection, and it's the Spirit that becomes the guarantee of resurrection, as was taught in 2 Corinthians 5. God has given us the Spirit as the guarantee. So it's the same concept. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 5, along with Ephesians 1, 13 and 14, Hebrews 7 and verse 22 here. Same idea all the way through.
Yeah, amen. Well, it appears to me that we are out of time. I knew that we wouldn't get to flesh that out tremendously. We'll try to pick up on it again next week because I want to share a quote from Eusebius. We have people telling us all the time, you guys don't agree with the patristic writers. You guys got to get with the early church writers. Well, I'm going to share something. If you'll remind me, William, I'll probably forget it between now and then. But anyway, I'll share something from Eusebius that none of those people that accuse us of rejecting the patristics, you guys got to follow the patristics, et cetera, they don't accept the patristics in this very regard about the already, but the not yet of the new covenant. Okay. So we'll do that next week. In the meantime, folks, thank you so much for joining us here on Two Guys in the Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William, great to be with you as always. Appreciate it.
Same here.